I'm translating. No, I'm not. Good, yes, into Japanese. No, into saltgrass. I thought of sort of offering a greeting in saltgrass, which is a language in Andrew's book. And it's so believable that at some point in the last few days I sent him a message saying, is that a real tribe or a fictional tribe? And it says right in the beginning of your book that it's a fictional tribe. So, speaking about verisimilitude, that people talk of, does this book feel real? The book feels very real to me, and I thought it was a real tribe. Anyway, let's backtrack. Welcome everybody. Erev Tov, good evening. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ilene Prusher. I'm a journalist and writer, and a friend of Andrew Tertes, who is the author of Jacob's Return, and I'm loving this dog-eared version of it because it reminds me of some of the amazing themes that come out in the book, including your connection to environmental values. And I was thinking of that in terms of the bookmarks that you chose to mark the book, sort of nothing was wasted. I really love that. Andrew is a not just a fellow friend and writer, but I think of as a fellow journeyer, traveler on a path that kind of includes writing and self-discovery and spirituality and different ways that they overlap, both in your life and in the characters in your book. And it's really an honor to get to be here to celebrate the launch of your book.
Well, thank you very much, Eileen. I'm very grateful that you're interviewing me tonight.
I'll just start off with a couple of background words on Andrew, and then I'd like to, for people who are maybe new to the book, who haven't had a chance to read it yet, and you can get a copy afterwards, maybe you can sign them, is just to give a little bit of background. And Andrew is originally from the San Francisco area, from the Bay Area, and he is an explorer of identity, place, culture, and spirit. It's part of what's described on the back cover of the book, but I think that's really the headline, and there's so much that's beneath that is quite deep that I'm really impressed with as I've been reading the book. Andrew studied at Tufts University. I asked him to give a bio, but because he's a humble person, I think before I didn't read all of it. But we've been encouraging and inspiring each other, I think, over the years that we've been friends and talking about different writing workshops in New York and Iowa, the idea of writing in community and getting to share our writing. We shared the opening chapters of each of our novels a few years ago. So it's exciting for me to be at this moment next to you and seeing this happen. So the last thing I'll mention from your bio is that Andrew moved here on his first visit to Israel in 2005, during which he met the lovely Shoshana Guggenheim, the artist, who's over there on the corner, and they have two lovely children who are great playmates with my children. And you can hear them now.
I'll just chime in to say that Eileen's first novel is coming out in a couple months, called Baghdad Fixer.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, just by a little bit more of introduction to this book, one of the strong themes that come out here is this overlap between Jewish identity and spirituality and Native American culture. And it's quite a fascinating either meshing or clashing of cultures that's quite new to me, that I haven't seen anyone write about that before. So maybe you could just give us a little sense for people who haven't had a chance to read yet, in a word, if that's possible, what is explored in this book, and then we'll get to hear Andrew read a bit from the different parts of the book.
Jacob is a secular man in San Francisco. He's a journalist who's been dedicated his whole life to environmental and social justice. As a boy, he was very connected to Judaism as a conservative Jew, and also very spiritually connected. A horrible event happened to him by a leadership figure in Judaism, and so it really distanced him for a couple decades, or a few decades. though he never really sought a home in someone else's religion, when he met Sheila Strongblood when he was studying at Berkeley University, they fell fast in love. And she's full-blood from the Saltgrass tribe, which is one of the tribes in San Joaquin Valley in California. There's about 40 tribes whose heritage is in that area, and I fictionalized that tribe, but mostly spent time with a tribe called the Tachiokut, about an hour south of Fresno, and that's where this particular tribe was inspired from. And Sheila is, unlike Jacob, she's very much attuned to her spiritual and religious ways, the menacing ways of her tribe. And she's very engaging and enchanting to Jacob, and he does follow her along, and over about 20 years of the relationship, they have 2 teenagers in their marriage. And he admires her practice, and she's always encouraging him to find his Jewish God. It's something that he's quite reticent to do, although there is a crisis in the book which pushes him to find himself in many ways.
I think that's a good overview. I mean, one of the things that strikes me in your novel is the sense of voice, and not just for characters, but I guess you would say spirits, because within the Native American culture there are these spirits or animal spirits that play a very important role. So I hope you'll give us a little window into that tonight. I think the thing I'd like to do most now is to turn it over to Andrew, have him read 1 or 2 sections, as much as he would like to read for now, and then in a little bit I'll ask some more questions, and then we'll open it up to some of your questions as well.
I'll read from early on in the book. At the beginning, the Strongblood Goldman family are in Hawaii, on the big island of Hawaii on the Kona side, and they're tooling around in a speedboat, and there's a boating accident where Sheila is in a coma, comes into a coma. And her parents actually come from California to help out, to do some healing ceremony, and also to help with the kids and with morale in general. So right after they land and get to the hospital, Sheila's mother spends time with her and the kids in the hospital, and the father, Leo Whitecrow, brings Jacob to the local fish fry. Big ribs and fish fry was wedged into the corner of the strip mall between a franchise shoe store and a pharmacy. Patrons were lining up out the door of the eatery. 5 people were sitting inside eating at 2 small tables, and 10 more were eating outside. "This is the best thing about our plane being delayed at the gate," Leo said. "Any earlier and Steve wouldn't have been our cabbie." "How are Laurel and Sage?" Jacob asked. "Torn up. Sage's baby is coming soon." "Johnny and the kids?" "Yeah, they're fine." "And Chief?" "He wanted to come. With him, there's always a battle between tribe business and getting kids to the ceremonies. We've been planning to calm down after this trip," Jacob said. "The rooms have been ready since Sheila called, and we always like to have one of the kids stay through the summer." The awning cast shadows upon them as they got closer to the entrance. "My girl hasn't left hibernation. This is my first barbecue all year." "I think we should head back." Jacob couldn't rid himself of thoughts of Sheila just lying there. "She'd be eating with us if she could." "What'll you boys have?" They had reached the counter. Jacob read the words under the smeared charcoal and grease on the server's apron. "All the fat, all the fun." "What's your lunch special?" Leo asked. "Ribs, chicken, coleslaw, fries, and Coke for $6.99. 2 of those in a doggy bag," Leo said. He urged Jacob toward a table that was being vacated. Jacob wiped fries and crumbs off the table with his hand, smudging grease onto his palm and fingers. He hardly noticed when Leo arrived at the table. "Jake, come back," Leo said, handing him a styrofoam plate heaped with meat and setting his own on the table. He went back for the Cokes and then squeezed into his chair. Jacob ate all his fries, while Leo devoured the beef and fat from the ribs. Jacob picked at the chicken and avoided the ribs, their presence on the plate turning his stomach. "Here," he said, stabbing them with a fork and dumping them on Leo's plate. Leo showered a handful of fries into the emptied space. Between bites, Leo asked about the kids. Jacob told him of Rachel's attempts at finding Sheila with the help of her spirit guide, and about Adam's distance. It'll take a long time for him to know who he is, Leo said. He's a boy warrior. He'll fight you. They're scared, Dad. Be weak with me and strong for them. He tore half the ribs off the stack and handed them back to Jacob. Eat these. Jacob looked at them for an instant as if he were supposed to pull them apart and make a wish. Okay, that's that section. I'm going to jump ahead to a part where Sheila is in her coma, has been going on for a few days.
You're not going to spoil the end of this, right?
No, I'm on page 56.
Okay. For those of us who haven't read them all.
Yeah. I am jumping to 56. There might be some new information.
Okay.
But in the place where Sheila is in her comatose state, her spirit is hovering. And this is her thoughts. I came from the seed of that sleeping medicine man and through the form of that sleeping woman. Sheila's spirit eyes moved from the figures of Isabel and Leah White Crow and took in that of Jacob. I am bound to this sleeping man with water and fire as my witnesses, portals and tides and time. How constricting this room is, how deathly this building, how can my spirit sing inside a web of electricity? Images of Rachel and Adam floated in Sheila's mind, two fledglings in the nest. What big plans this year has in store for you, my daughter, so close to bravery while believing her wings clipped by fear. Under my care, will she accept how much she has learned of plant and dream? What does her program of study matter? It will be the conduit for the manifestation of her wisdom. Tenderfoot, take the steps as only you can. The wind of her desire took Sheila beyond the confinement of walls and electronic beeps. She could feel the ebb and flow of waves on sand. Gallop with willow. Remember you are formed of spirit. The memory of Rachel sharing secret words from her diary became a focus for Sheila's spirit. She felt herself condense into a desire to hold her pained daughter. We each have our journeys to find self and partner. Even bound by love and promise, there could be years of discovery. When you turned from love of plants to love of chemistry, I didn't see that the prize was the same, only the doorway different. Bind yourself to spirit's language that you understand as your own. You will always be a daughter of salt and grass. Your mother tongue is the one inscribed inside your heart. Now you explore loneliness, but that can free you to experience a life that knows you are never alone, with or without me. The way you read to me today was how you will read to your daughter. Your voice was a vessel in which questions can flourish, a chamber for pain and wonder. When your hair is a silver braid upon your back, and a grandchild sits on your lap, you will teach her my medicine filtered through the weavings of your times. By then, your times will have transformed your losses into jewels. I'll read one more little section. And jumping ahead but not giving real answers. Adam, the teenage boy, the youngest of the family, is back in San Francisco, and he is working at Rasputin's Music. It's a hip-hoppy, very trendy record store. At 8 o'clock that night, Adam arrived for his shift at Rasputin Music on Powell Street. He punched his card and peeked into the manager's cubicle. Vinny was deep in a pile of packing slips and invoices. "If it ain't the professor himself," Vinny said. "I can't high-five with this mess." "Yo," Adam said. "Word." "Des left plenty of restock for you. You shouldn't be bored." "Thanks," Adam said. He shuffled out of the employee corner and toward the back of the store. There were plenty of customers for a weeknight in February. They'd be gone in an hour, and he'd be gone in 2. He high-fived Tiff in the electronicus aisle on his way back to storage. She was thumbing through CDs in GABA and Goa trance. Electronica was in her blood, although Des said Tiff didn't have blood, only ecstasy. But Des was jealous of the sorters. She loved music like they all did, but she couldn't distinguish dark core from electroclash or acid house from Italo house. He couldn't care less about those styles. Electricity worked for him through guitars, mics, and amps. Adam found the old canvas mail cart sagging at the bottom, piled high with hundreds of discs for restock. He reached in and pulled out 3 CDs in a row that must have fetched top dollar. India Ari's Testimony, Volume 1, Dave Matthews Band, Big Whiskey and the Grugruts King, and Green Day's American Idiot. He pushed the cart first to the rock section, thinking that he might scoop up Matthews' tribute to his brother. A guy in a rumpled jacket took the Green Day album from Adam's hand as he was about to put it back on the shelf and said, "Best rock opera since Tommy. Sweet." Adam nodded and dug into the cart. He knew he should sort what was inside, but he couldn't deal with sitting anymore. He looked up and across the store to see if Vinny was watching. The manager was nowhere in sight, just Tiff, flying along in electronica, and Fred, walking down the next aisle. He dug into the cart and pulled out Eurythmics and Stevie Wonder. He grabbed a couple more, Tracy Chapman and Julio Iglesias. He laughed. Someone dumped their rock and pop collection and Julio fell into the pool. "Professor," Fred said. Adam looked up and said, "Hey, when are you going to stock your own album?" Adam said, "Keep the faith. What's up?" "Chillin'," Fred said. "Look out for Mogwai's special moves and 2-packs loyal to the game for me." "Me Against the World is 2-packs best," Adam said. "Like I don't have it? Keep your eye peeled?" Adam nodded. He said, "I like Mogwai's time signatures. Just promise you'll taste math." Fred said, "I'm building my appetite." He walked down the aisle. Adam smiled to himself as he pushed the cart. He liked being called Professor, though he didn't have much to show for it. Don wanted their band to record a demo, but Adam kept insisting that they needed a few more songs. Vinny had spread the nickname around after hearing their song, Iron Tracks. He compared them to the Dillinger Escape Plan. "Keep the rhythms angular," Vinny had said. "Too many bands try too hard to make a sound. All they get is noise. There's enough precision in that tune to tie up an audience." Vinny DJ'd mathcore and math rock. He was rumored to have been the Bay Area's top punk DJ in his time. Adam liked his job mostly because it could keep the band in acoustic research ad infinitum, or ad nauseum, as Ricky had said once. Ever since Adam had brought home Slint, Botch, and Shellac, Don didn't want much else. He felt that he had to keep refreshing them with their roots. Red Hot Chili Peppers and Metallica. Jay called it returning to the fountain. Her version of Breaking the Girl took the Peppers to new heights. Maybe Jade will record that someday. I'm jumping ahead in the section till after Adam stocks a bunch of CDs, talks with his friends there, and he comes upon an album. He shuffled for another CD. He felt like his throat was closing. A Native American teenage boy was looking off into the distance. It was Robbie Robertson and the Red Road Ensembles, music for the Native Americans. The album was a family favorite. Adam had been a baby when it came out, and he knew the cover picture well. He used to call the boy Eagle Boy. The eagle feathers tied in his hair would be his someday. He would be wingman. Adam sat down on the floor. This day was too much. He expected school to knock him on his ass sometimes. There was just too much opportunity for it, what with all the posturing and pressures. But music, too? He closed his eyes, remembering. He was sitting next to Mom. Rachel was on her other side. Eulalie was performing at the Montclair Women's Cultural Arts Club. They were just 2 rows back. He could see clearly Pura Fay, Sony, and Jennifer on stage. Rachel always said that the band was her favorite, that the women were her mentors. His crush on Jennifer kept him from saying much about the music. The harmonies were crazy good. Halfway through the performance, Jennifer had called out, "We need a volunteer, a man." His mother had nudged his arm upwards, and he hadn't been quick enough to pull it down. He would have been called a wimp or a wuss if he didn't climb onto the stage. Jennifer had him stand behind them. "What tribe are you from?" Jennifer had asked. "Saltgrass and Jewish." Adam remembered he'd been surprised at himself when that came out. Jennifer nodded. "You're a warrior in a canoe tonight," she said. Adam stood watching the drums and listening for his cue. "Hey!" he shouted. "Louder," Jennifer told him. "Hey!" he shouted. It took another prod until he closed his eyes and shouted the way he would at ceremony. When Adam left the stage, the audience, easily 200 people, cheered him. He zoned them out, embarrassed, and walked back to his seat. His mother had squeezed his thigh and laughed, but he brushed off her hand. Even Rachel had joined in, reaching around her mother and pinching him under his arm. He had been blushing. If it wasn't for the harmonies and drumbeat that filled his senses, he didn't know what he'd do. Adam turned over the Robbie Robertson album and looked for Eulali's contributions. Pure Faye's original Ma Jehi, the heartbeat drum song, and the traditional ancestor song. Both songs were heaven, if you wanted to allow Father Sky to rip out your heart. Almost a year later, and he still thought she'd be there when he got home from school. He still wanted to tell her about his day and every day. A sad laugh spurted from his mouth. He didn't even feel like it was him. He looked at the album, and he remembered how happy he had been to find out that Robbie and Jennifer both had Jewish fathers. Had Mom told him, or was it Rachel? He wondered again where their fathers were and how connected they were to their Jewish side. Had they done bar or bat mitzvahs, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur? Robbie had found his Mohawk roots, and Jennifer her Tuscarora lineage. He kicked idly at the cart, wondering despondently if he'd ever work out how he felt about his own mixed heritage, if he'd ever be able to reconcile his two sides. He wondered if his father would help him, or if he'd just stay stuck in his own head.
I really enjoyed listening to that as much as I enjoyed reading it, because it gives a different feeling. And as I predicted, the questions I wrote down are not necessarily the ones I want to start with. So one of the questions I would like to start with that really struck me both when I read the book and as you were reading just now is all of these Native American characters with these very typical American names like Robbie and Jennifer and Adam and Rachel. I mean, Adam and Rachel are half, and some of these other characters are half Native American and half Jewish, or he meets other people who are half something else. But we meet, for example, Sheila and her parents, Leo and Isabel. Very American-sounding names. Although we also sometimes learn they have their Indian names as well. And I found it fascinating that almost nobody was going just by their Indian name, or very few characters were, which kind of resonates in a way with the Jewish American experience, and I wondered if you could speak a little bit about that as you were doing some of the research for the novel, maybe you didn't know when you first started that you were researching a novel, you became interested in Native American culture, but did you find that there were, I guess, for lack of a better term, assimilationist tendencies that you find in American culture and basically in all minorities everywhere in the world?
That's a good question. The time that I had already been spending time doing Sweat Lodge, involved in a women's community. I was invited as a man in Hummingbird Lodge in Oakland, and every month there'd be a whole day preparing the fire and clearing the grounds, making a feast, and then praying the Sweat Lodge.
Maybe you should just tell it might be for people who don't know what a Sweat Lodge is.
A Sweat Lodge, there's a Sweat Lodge in the Plains Indians tradition and the California Indian tradition. Those are the two that I know. In the Plains tradition, which is I think most known right now is a warrior sweat, which it's a frame of branches, usually willow, and it can be any size, but there's a dugout in the center. Whoever is the firekeeper who comes maybe at dawn builds a very large fire and puts what they call the ancestors. These are usually volcanic rocks, depending on the location, sometimes limestone, and there's a certain number of these ancestor rocks that are put into the fire. The fire could be a bonfire for 6 or 10 hours. The rocks start glowing red, and then it's time, once the rocks are ready, and whoever's leading the sweat lodge, which is a prayer ceremony, invites everyone to gather, and there's someone usually who smudges the people who are going to enter, which is putting a stick of herbs, often sage or sweetgrass, and spreading the smoke over the body as a cleansing. And then people enter the lodge. The lodge is usually 3 or 4 rounds, and once the flap of the lodge is closed, it's often pitch black inside until someone inside sprinkles herbs on the rocks, which glow, and oftentimes you can lose, I've lost track of space, and it looks like the stars. You're just floating, it felt like floating sometimes, and it's very, very hot in the warrior lodge. Water is often added to the rocks. It's much hotter than a schwitz. And then there's prayers. Usually there's, it could be community prayers, or it could either start with community prayers and go all the way to personal, or vice versa. Most sweat lodges I've been involved in, I've been invited to offer prayer as a Jew. And I've often shared the Shema and led that in call and response, which has been a profound experience. The California sweat, Indian sweat, which I spent a number of times doing that with the Batya Gur in Southern California, is not a warrior sweat, it's a family sweat. And there could be 40 men, women, and children with instruments inside that. And it's also hot, but not unbearable. And there's also amazing singing in these experiences. And the point is to connect to spirit and to get clear of what the baggage people are carrying, and sometimes ask for healing. But I'll then move to the other part of the question about assimilation and names. In California, as in many states, it was illegal until a few decades ago for Native Americans to actually practice sweat lodge and other ceremonies. Bear dance is another ceremony in the California tribes. So the pre-American government and then the early government separated tribes and children from their land, and moved tribes from their land, reservations, and urbanized a lot of Southwest and Western Native American peoples. And the idea by the government was to assimilate. Sheila's mother is Isabel, and there's a lot of Native Americans who are also part Latino, Hispanic, and Spanish is one of the languages spoken, and Leo is Leo White Crow. It's become very common for families to give the dominant culture names, and it's the California tribes that I've been in touch with have only recently had the funds, some of it through casinos, and some of it through just getting over great poverty and other issues, to start to reclaim their ceremonies, and that's where some of the names start to come back. And as far as Judaism, we have other stories about assimilation names.
Yeah, absolutely. As you were speaking, I was thinking about the sense of place that comes across in the novel, and very much so in the tribal areas, and also when they're not on the res, as the characters call it, the reservation. And I was wondering, as a writer, you spent time as you were becoming more and more interested in Native American spirituality, and then maybe going back as a writer and possibly interviewing people about subjects. How did you make decisions, or maybe as a writer, it's not when you're writing fiction. Sometimes it's not making decisions, but letting your characters make decisions. They sometimes take on a life of their own, and you sort of let them take off and tell their story to you. And I'm just wondering, for you, was it difficult to set aside people you had met in real life and say, okay, that was what Joe told me, but I'm going to make a fictional character that's only 10% Joe, not this Joe, but another Joe on the res. And how did that work for you as a writer? How were you able to spin some degree of reality into a fictional reality?
I think with the Native American characters, Sheila came very quickly, as did Rachel. And in the first meeting that I had with Chief Clarence Atwell, I don't know, maybe 11 years ago or so, he put me on the phone with this spirit interpreter of the tribe. And it's someone who did some of the healing ceremonies and other spiritual rituals, and I told him the character names, Strongblood, the White Crow, and all that, and he said, these are good names. And those characters felt right for me, and I didn't have, they felt like the information about them came independently. Some of the Jewish characters, I had to separate more of some of the actual thoughts I had or experiences I had with some Jewish characters in my life.
Yeah. I mean, following up from that, we talked a little bit just recently about, again, how sometimes you think a book is going to go in one direction, and then the writing takes you in a different direction, and your characters go on a journey, and you go on your own journey as well. Are there things that came out of this return, of Jacob's return, that were surprising to you, either for your characters or for yourself?
That first visit I had with Clarence Atwell, who was chief at the time, he had a few teenagers there and a travel historian, the security guard. We were all sitting around this large table. I had bought a hand-carved ebony and other wood mezuzah. I wanted to meet him in a way that was coming as a Jew and as a writer. And so I presented this to him, and I was scared. I didn't know how the meeting would go, because on the phone he was a little, he was distant, and I found out he's not a man of many words. He's a very strong person, but with few words. And so I sat down and he said, "So, why are you here?" And so I presented the mezuzah, and I told him that it was an amulet that Jews put on our doors, and that I talked about the Shema, and it seemed to open a space. And at some point he started telling me stories about his childhood and his family. And at some point, after hearing him use some of the language of his childhood, the Batya Gur, I said, "May I use some of these stories in my novel, some of the language?" He said, "That's not for me to say. That's for going on the hill." And what I knew that meant from my native friends is that was a 4-night, 3-day fast with no food and no water. And it happened to take place on Sukkot that year, which was my first Sukkot that I was actually mindful of as an adult. I brought a lulav and etrog and I made a prayer lodge out of pepperwood and a tarp, and I had my 4-night, 3-day fast. And each morning the chief would come and open the tarp for the day and just see that I was alive. I mean, that's how it felt. Are you alive? And then they let me in for my prayer. And that fast was something I didn't ever expect to do. And through that, it formed some trust in my relationship with some other folks there, that I have some close friendships that developed out of that. I happened to have started the fast a day later than some other fasters who were on the hill because I couldn't find the place. And that's a long story I'll tell another time. So what it meant is I had the opportunity to stay by myself on the hill the last night, and there was folks in camp drumming. I heard coyotes come to me, and at some point I started roaring like a lion and just having a catharsis. And when I was brought out of the lodge in the morning, there were lion tracks and bear tracks around my lodge, large ones. And even though I knew it was bear country, it was on Mono tribe land in the Sierra Nevadas, I really had no idea really how close the wild was to me at that time.
Fascinating. There's one thing I would love to take the liberty to do is to read a little half of a paragraph of yours from the book that I really like, and to ask you to maybe unpack just a little bit of this. But this is Jacob waiting for his wife, Sheila, who was in a coma at this point. And this is a sort of spirit has a presence that's speaking to Jacob. Is that fair enough as background for that paragraph? No, not to those on
Hears, but yes.
He doesn't hear it, right, okay. There you are, Jacob, on the cot. Jacob, clinging to the temporary. Delude yourself no more. You have ancient bones. From here I see your line stretching across lands and waters. The logic of our love is clear from this hovering place. You are no fledgling, you are full grown. Your garden of exile is laden with fruit. There may be no salt grass or tool in your garden, but from here I see olive and carob and pomegranate and grape. How I would love to eat from your harvest and drink your ferment. Very much sort of imagery that to me is kind of an allegory for the land of Israel: olive, carob, pomegranate, and grape. How does this culture of Native America, which seems kind of very far from Jewish culture in Israel, how do they link up through this voice?
I'll acknowledge that we're in the harvest season we just passed grape, but of the other fruits you mentioned. California, the landscape has much of the landscape, in my experience, as Israel does. The desert, the hills, very dry, and also some of the lusher and mountainous areas. I think Sheila is, in her spirit voice, finding a poetic essence of what she longs for Jacob. What she also grew up with biblical stories. From the res, there would be the Native American teachings she's received, especially because her grandmother's a medicine woman, and she is as well. But the Christian Bible, that she knows the land of Israel through the stories, and definitely not for Jacob. And she's been nudging him for a long time to find that connection. So I think it's more through what she knows is possible for him as a spiritual being.
I think maybe it'll be nice to open it up to a question or two from people who are here. And even if you haven't read the book, it can just be something about the writing process, how you create characters, how you write settings. It can be something broad and not just on Jacob's return, because I know some of you are just delving into it now. Judith.
I had the honor of receiving the book. When was the Batya Gur?
It was
How old was
late
your
April.
child?
She's 5 months
Yeah,
tomorrow.
That was a month. So it was 4 months
so
ago.
4 months.
So 4 months ago, I was honored to receive a copy of the book, and I explained to Andrew that I have a deadline on a really big writing project, and I couldn't allow myself to read a novel. And I looked at a couple of the pages, and I have to confess that the first sentence with the The Trail of Saliva. I didn't like that. And I said, well, he wants me to read a novel that begins with The Trail of Saliva. What's this about? But I said I would look at it when I'm done with my work. So I'm getting close to it. And I knew I was going to be speaking, seeing you tonight. And I started to read it this afternoon. And I knew it was the right decision to not read it before, because it's the kind of novel that once you get into it, you're not going to be able to put it down. It's really intensely wonderful. The thing that I'm having trouble separating out is how spiritually nourishing it feels to read about this presence of the spirits and the connection to things we can't see. And my desire to connect that way Jewishly, like, wouldn't that be great? I know we're supposed to, but maybe living in Israel and doing everything is just like so exhausting that you don't get to feel that spirit or something. I don't know what the problem is, but I felt like connecting spiritually by just hearing what these characters were saying. Really. So it's a very important thing that you did. I don't know. I just read the first, I just read 25 pages. And I
keep reading after that?
Yeah, pardon?
Is there a question that comes out?
Okay, so the question I have is specifically in the first 25 pages we're introduced to the teenage daughter. And I feel like you got, how old is she? Like 15, 16? 17. How did you get a 17-year-old girl so well? How did you do that? That's the question.
She and her mom came very simply for me. One idea that comes about that is spending a couple years in a women's community sweat lodge, and having a number of friends who were medicine women. That's what comes to mind. But as far as about the Jewish connection, read on.
Is that terrible to say?
No, read on.
Okay.
I'm not sure if this mic works that well, so I don't know if people have other questions. It might be that if you just stand up and project a little bit. If there's another question back there? Bana, can you project, or shall I try to pass that to you?
Andrew, first of all, I love the novel. It's lovely, and I highly recommend it. I'm curious about whether you feel that you were writing the novel in order to enable people to understand your own spiritual journey between these cultures. And the novel is sort of the platform for sharing that spiritual insight and the pathway that you're negotiating or that you're following in some kind of flow, or whether the characters, well, I won't say or whether. I can feel that there's a theology in the novel, and I'm wondering how that works for you. Is that the starting point, the end point, the middle point, the process, the writing? Talk about that.
Before I answer, what theology do you see in the novel?
I'm not sure if I want to spoil it.
Okay, we'll talk about that. There's some before and after questions of what was first, what came after. I've often been asked, how autobiographical is this story? My experience is that Jacob became a character, and Sheila, I had big questions. Questions about the themes, questions about what putting these two cultures, these two people and their children together, what that would be like. And in a way it was throwing out a long fishing line and then reeling for many years to discover myself and the story. Sometimes I was discovering the story first, and I was receiving quite a profound gift, like the fast. It wasn't that I fasted then thought, oh, I'll write a story where a fast is important. Once I did it, it was obvious that Jacob would have to fast. And then exploring some of my interests in Native America, it was Jacob and the story that gave me the bravery to contact this particular tribe and go there and face, why are you here? And to 6 years later, on my way to Israel, go to a lodge and have Chief Atwell say, here's our friend who remembers us, and he's going home. We want to bless him. And so, and I gave him my manuscript that, for me in a few words, giving him about 100,000 words in 8